Over the course of this series of video responses to Feminist Frequency, I have highlighted some of the shortcomings of Anita's general approach. In this last video, I'll examine her mission statement video, as well as talk about the general framing of her videos.
I started Feminist Frequency because I felt like feminism was sort of trapped in academic spaces and politically radical spaces. They talked about systems of oppression and privilege, but it was in this language that was really hard to understand, and I wanted to create a space where feminism was easy to engage with in an accessible way.
I used to think that the phrase ivory tower was used by anti-intellectuals to dismiss the academic work that challenged people's conventional worldview. Slowly, though, I've come to see that there's actual merit to this phrase, and what Anita is saying here is a good example of it. Academia has a tendency to alienate the general audience because the system itself creates an artificial economy of information. Often the audience of an academic paper is a specialized audience, and the goal of writing is often tinged with the university politics of getting tenure or promotion. In other words, addressing a general public isn't even the point. Whereas the economics of Hollywood all but demand that movies appeal to the widest possible audience to make as much money as possible, the artificial knowledge economy of academia dictates that articles engage with a very small and specialized audience to gain prestige within a certain field. Esoteric jargon is all a part of the game, and the game is not to enlighten the general public. I think that her goal is noble, but I also think that she falls short. While her videos may not be loaded with academic jargon, that does not mean that they do a good job of explaining these issues and concepts to a general audience. As I see it, there is a gap between what Anita sees herself doing with Feminist Frequency and what she is actually doing. This is what she claims to be doing.
I try to provide the tools to give people the language to talk about sexism and issues of gender using accessible language from popular culture, such as TV shows, movies, comic books, and video games.
Now, it is difficult to characterize all of her videos. Some of them come closer to the mark than others. But looking at the majority of her work, I think that Feminist Frequency has a serious framing problem. Whenever someone speaks, they make assumptions about the audience. For example, throughout this series, I've gone back and forth between saying Anita and Feminist Frequency and the assumption that the audience understands that I'm referring to the same person in both cases. This is one of countless assumptions. They're necessary in communication. Another way to analyze how somebody speaks is their rhetorical approach. A message will be delivered differently to an audience of like-minded people than people they are attempting to persuade. Feminist Frequency videos make references to concepts, information, points of view, and ideas that the rest of the audience may or may not be familiar with. Here's a couple of examples.
In our current patriarchal society, however, traits associated with men and masculinity are more highly valued. Women are being institutionally oppressed all the time in nearly every facet of our lives.
If you're going to search through Feminist Frequency videos for any sort of in-depth explanation of concepts like patriarchy, institutional oppression, privilege, etc., you would be looking in vain. The assumption, in spite of all evidence to the contrary, is that the audience is generally like-minded, and thus the rhetorical strategy is not one of persuading and informing, but of preaching to the converted. Some terms, like patriarchy, might as well be academic jargon, because the way that they are used by feminists is not the way that they are understood by the average person. This disconnect is one of the reasons so many people are so dismissive of feminism. Other terms, like institutional oppression and privilege, to the extent which they're understood at all, are often met with denial and hostility, and thus it is quite presumptuous to toss these terms around as if the audience is on board with what you're saying. Moreover, it's worth asking whether or not she is speaking the language of popular culture, or speaking the language of feminism about popular culture. The difference would be like the difference between speaking a language versus linguistics. One is communicating through the words and grammar of a particular language, the other is analyzing the patterns of languages. I would argue that Feminist Frequency is more like a pop culture linguist than a fluent speaker of popular culture. I say this partly in light of the fact that I've been to college, and I've even taken a course which is much like what Feminist Frequency claims to be. It was called Examining Diversity Through Film. If Feminist Frequency was a class, it would probably be called Pointing Out That Film Lacks Diversity. Not an invalid point, but not the same. In Examining Diversity Through Film, we first read articles on a specific topic, such as sexism, racism, ableism, classism, etc., and then we would watch a film clip or TV clip which was relevant to the subject at hand, and then we would discuss how the clip related to the subject we were discussing. pop culture was being used to help illuminate social issues. I think that's quite a powerful tool, but that's not quite what FeministFrequency does. Using the language of popular culture to talk about sexism would be more like, sexism is sort of like in that scene from that movie where fill in the blank. Pop culture can be a common reference from which to make a point, but what FeministFrequency does is more like point out trends and critique institutions than what I've just described.
I think it's important to critically engage with video games and comic books and movies and TV shows because it's a reflection of our society. I think that there's a lot of negative stereotypes and stories in the media that work to amplify and perpetuate oppressive social norms.
Media does reflect our society, and so it is a good jumping off point, but perpetuating stereotypes is only one of the possible avenues we can take the discussion. We could also use it as an opportunity to ask ourselves if what media reflects is actual reality or just what people commonly think. To be blunt, I think there's a certain futility in charging against the windmill of Hollywood. It's tempting to target popular culture because of its ubiquity, but I think that real change comes in the mind of the audience, and then culture follows. Returning to the issue of addressing the audience, do we have any hints as to who Anita has in mind as the audience of her videos?
FeministFrequency videos have been used in middle school, high school, and university classrooms. They've been integrated into the curriculum of media studies, gender studies, and law school programs.
Wait a minute.
I started FeministFrequency because I felt like feminism was sort of trapped in academic spaces.
Something does not need to be shrouded in incomprehensible language in order to be trapped in academia. While there's a temptation to believe that all information is available to all people in the age of the internet, it does not mean that all people have learned the same things. While it may be the case that FeministFrequency videos make for good material to augment gender studies courses, we should bear in mind that most people have never been exposed to those courses and what they have to offer. It's one thing for FeministFrequency videos to make sense in the context of a classroom or the pages of bitch media. It's another for them to stand on their own. I don't get it. Well, why is she going on and on about the media and women in the media and video games and depictions of the media? What's this all about? Dude, it says right there in the corner, bitch media. What the hell is Bitch Magazine? Bitch Media is a feminist magazine that examines popular culture. I don't understand. What does feminism have to do with the media? What does it mean to address a truly general audience, and not just those privileged enough to have received a college education? Let's start with Anita herself. This is a clip from her talking about toy commercials.
Holy crap, what is going on here? Clearly it's been a while since I've raced home after school to watch cartoons, but I was amazed at how highly gendered these commercials were. Have they changed, or did I just not notice them before?
The basic answer is that she just did not notice before. This is important to note because it's an indication of the mindset of a general audience. Most people are probably not going to examine popular culture from that perspective, so it's worth asking how she arrived at that perspective. The status quo does not get to be the status quo because everyone inevitably recognizes and starts to challenge it. It does it by flying under the radar of our awareness. Anita likely started to become aware of gendered toy advertising through her education, but that is probably what she has least in common with the general audience. To engage a general audience with an issue like feminism means that you should probably be prepared to take the rhetorical strategy of informing and persuading as often as possible. Feminists actually have a term for this: consciousness raising. Perhaps start by examining the conceptual underpinnings of what you're saying and try to make them as clear as possible for the audience. This helps the audience follow the argument more clearly and helps eliminate miscommunications and misperception. In case if what I'm saying is a bit opaque, let me use an example. The idea that gender is a social construct is a key idea in feminist theory. Moreover, unless you have been exposed to this idea, you are not likely to fully grasp what FeministFrequency is getting at in her videos about toys and Legos. But while she does discuss this idea in passing, she makes only a superficial and non-compelling argument for it.
Using the language of natural or nature in reference to gender infers that girls are biologically predisposed to like dolls and pink things. As noted by Peggy Ornstein in her book Cinderella Ate My Daughter, if we look to the turn of the century, this gendered color dynamic was actually reversed. In the early 1900s, blue was associated with baby girls and pink with baby boys. Really? It might be hard to believe, but you can look it up. This demonstrates that color association with gender is a social construct. It's not biological, it's not genetic, it's not natural, it's made up.
Honestly, if not for the fact that I had already been exposed to this concept before Feminist Frequency videos, I'm not sure I would have been convinced by this argument, and I can understand why other people would not be. But again, an understanding of this issue is vital to what she's talking about, but she is deferring to the assumption that the audience already understands. This is a mistake. Making videos explaining basic concepts might not win you points with other feminists or academics because it would seem overly simplistic and a bit too feminist 101, but it would go much further towards a public education on the issue. Moving on, Anita majored in communications, and so she's probably familiar with the phrase, "the medium is the message."
I chose a video web series format because I wanted to speak clearly and directly on some of these really complex issues. I put my videos on YouTube because I wanted to speak to my generation about systems of privilege and oppression and feminism, and increasingly we're an audiovisual culture. We're engaging with popular culture through remixing and video blogging in really interesting ways, and I feel like that's where the learning is actually happening.
I must confess that when I first discovered Feminist Frequency videos, I was going through a bit of a Neil Postman phase. What is fascinating about this clip and the video that it's from is that she is prominently displaying books in a video where she is celebrating the demise of print culture in favor of new media. Visual media has a tendency to hollow out content and nuance in favor of visuals. The danger is that complex issues get reduced to PowerPoint presentations. And to be brutally honest, that is how I would characterize a lot of what Feminist Frequency does. PowerPoint feminism. This is not because she is unintelligent or uneducated, it's because she is making videos.
I hope you enjoyed that video. It was probably my most ambitious project to date and took an enormous amount of time to put together.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say from my years of experience making video that the majority of the time and effort she's talking about went into making the videos themselves rather than to the script of the video. The more you want to say, the more complexly you want to say it, the more difficult it is to put it in video form. Thus, visual media pushes content creators towards concision. Making your points quickly and concisely tends to lead towards framing things in a way that preaches to the converted. In other words, my earlier criticisms about the way Feminist Frequency frames her videos is part and parcel of the limitations of the medium.
And I feel like that's where the learning is actually happening.
Flying spaghetti monster, help us all. Postman's basic point in amusing ourselves to death is that visual media tends to dumb things down. Let me say this in no uncertain terms. The greatest danger to feminism is not the Powerpuff Girls using the straw feminist trope. It is people getting their ideas of feminism from a cartoon. It surprised me somewhat to see someone who centers her entire project on examining and criticizing the media and its effects on our culture would seem to overlook the shortcomings of new media. Perhaps this is because it doesn't provide the convenient, tangible enemy of institutions to wag your finger at. In spite of all the seeming potential of new media and its ability to level the playing field for those outside of traditional media, more often than not, the communication style of new media mirrors that of old media. Opinionated blowhards shout at and belittle their guests on shows like The O'Reilly Factor with little concern for anything resembling serious discussion, and we see the same behaviors from countless video bloggers. Even when people are free of the commercial and ideological constraints of old media, we still see them emulate the styles of conflict-based communication, concision, brevity, showmanship, and other aspects of style that define traditional media. Why? Because it's better at pulling an audience, and that should tell us quite a lot about why traditional media operates the way that it does. I'm not trying to say that there's nothing to be learned from people making video blogs. What I'm trying to say is that if it is the only place which learning is happening, then we are an impoverished culture indeed. Finally, and by finally I mean in conclusion to this entire series, in her video about the Oscars and the Bechdel test, she made a couple of statements about the male-dominated nature of Hollywood stories, and then she proposed a solution to this. Although I think that when you put the two statements together, that there's actually something missing from what she's saying, so I'll play them now.
Men are still primarily the studio executives, the writers, the directors, and the major decision makers in the industry, and they tell stories that they can relate to. Not surprisingly, this results in most movies focusing on men and men's stories. It's depressingly clear that Hollywood doesn't prioritize roles for women and isn't interested in telling women's stories. The real solution here is for filmmakers and screenwriters to focus more movies on women and women's lives. That's really how we solve this problem.
So note here that in the first part she says that men dominate Hollywood and make stories that they can relate to as men, and therefore most Hollywood stories end up being about men. And in the next clip, she says that the solution to all of this is more stories about women. But what would actually follow from what she said in the first part is that if you want more women, and writers and producers generally create what is relevant to them, then you actually need more female writers, producers, and directors in Hollywood. So it's not saying that what she said in that part is wrong, it's just that there's something missing, and that's more women is what's missing from what she said. So yeah, female writers of the world, get out there and make some movies. And that concludes this series. Stay tuned for Tropes versus Feminist Frequency.